Well, I'm really excited to meet our next guest today, Talasi Guerra. She's an author, a speaker. She's a leader in a church in Langley, BC. Talasi, welcome to 700 Club Canada.
Thank you so much for having me this morning.
Well, you've written a wonderful book called Joy Like a Mountain. And in this book, you share your personal journey of coming through a battle with anorexia and depression. And I just love you to start there by sharing a little of the backstory and what shaped your perspective on joy coming through that journey.
Absolutely. I grew up in the church. I grew up with a faith background, and that really shaped my worldview in a lot of positive ways. But I think it also had an influence on an early struggle that I had with maybe what you might call kind of moral perfectionism. As a kid, I just wanted to be good. I wanted to be good enough, and always wanted to get approval, make my parents proud, especially wanted God to be happy with me. And I think that as a result of that, I developed some pretty perfectionistic tendencies growing up. But then, of course, as a teenager, I went through the phase that most adolescents do, where you kind of go through life searching for your sense of value and experimenting in different places to try to figure out who you are. And what ended up happening for me is that I made some choices in that season that really didn't line up with the Christian worldview that I grew up with. And as a result, I started to experience a lot of shame and a lot of guilt because of that, perfectionism piece, that my self-esteem kind of started to plummet because now I was making bad choices. And then I started to equate that with now I'm a bad person. And that's really where it all began for me. Not really knowing how to manage those negative feelings about myself in a healthy, positive way, which I would say added to the guilt, because I knew what the Bible, I knew what the Bible said and how I was supposed to be living, how I believed I should be living. But this quickly started to spiral out of control in my life into this endless cycle of guilt and worthlessness, and then bad decisions and more guilt and more bad decisions. And ultimately that manifested in my life as an eating disorder, a severe eating disorder, as well as depression and anxiety. And living in this kind of prison, this bondage, really led me to down this path of believing that joy just wasn't really an option in my life. And that also added to the guilt because, like the Bible says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. I'd grown up with those words and I knew what God was saying about joy, but I just didn't live it in my experience. I didn't think it was possible for me. And so that really shaped this idea for me that joy really is only possible in kind of a fictional world, but it's not possible in my world.
Wow. I think so many people listening are going, they're right there right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like joy's first, maybe it's a personality issue, like maybe it's not ever for me. But tell me then, how did you come through this journey of depression and anorexia and, fueled by shame and guilt? And yet now you've written a book called Joy Like a Mountain. Like, what was it? How did you get there?
Absolutely. It was a journey for sure. I've been eating disorder free now for well over 10 years, but even after kind of getting my physical health back on track, there was a long process of recovering from that depression and that anxiety. But, I've always felt that God works healings in different ways. Sometimes it's miraculous and it's instantaneous. And other times it's a gradual process. And neither one is more spiritual or more real. But for me, it was gradual. And I really believe that's just as much a testimony of God's power and goodness as the miraculous in the moment healing. But for me, this journey was gradual, just like the journey of writing this book. And God has kind of had me in this process of understanding what is joy all about. And he's been challenging me about joy for many years. But it was probably in this last year that he really kicked that challenge up a notch. Last year, I was asked to speak several different times on the topic of joy. And I just started to feel like, okay, God, wow. I get the idea. You're really trying to talk to me about something here. And so I decided I would take 1 month to do an in-depth kind of deep dive study into what biblical joy is all about. And I took some time to intentionally implement some application practices in my own life. And it was really life-changing. It was revolutionary for me because it made me realize that even as someone who has a background with severe mental illness, I actually can experience joy if I'm intentional about it. And it also really opened up my eyes to a whole new level of God's healing in my life. And so kind of as soon as I started that challenge, I had this feeling, this really could be a book one day. So I kept that in the back of my mind. I chewed on it for the rest of the year, and then I started drafting the book earlier this year in January.
Well, I really appreciate what you're saying, that often healing is a journey, and it's as miraculous as those instantaneous healings, because in journey, God teaches us a lot of lessons. So break it down for us, like people watching, how did you choose joy? How is joy like a mountain? It's this journey. Is joy the top of the mountain and something to be achieved? Tell us some of the lessons that you unpack for us in your book and that you've learned in your life.
Absolutely. I think the reality is that we face challenges in life, right? We can't escape hardships that life is going to throw at us. And I think my mistake that I made earlier on in life was seeing joy as the goal and seeing joy as the summit of the mountain, the top of the mountain. And I can only experience it if I can reach that top. And as I started processing these ideas and working through this book, I realized, you know what, that's not right. We're just on a mountain. Life is the mountain. And joy is like a mountain because it feels like a climb. Choosing joy sometimes in the midst of hardships, it feels like an incredibly challenging, arduous climb. But joy actually is possible at every step of the journey along this mountain path. And we can find it and we can search it and we can actually grow as a result of it if we choose it in the midst of the hardships as we're climbing the mountain of life. Romans 5 verses 3 and 4 say we rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And I just thought, man, that is so powerful because it shows that it's not just suffering, but it's joy in the midst of suffering that will actually bring about this change in us and will produce these three essential characteristics that we need if we're going to navigate life in a healthy way. We need endurance and character and hope. And so that's why I think joy, it's critical in the midst of climbing this mountain of life, because it's joy in suffering, joy in challenges that is going to give us what we need, the qualities that we need to actually navigate life in a healthy way.
That's so good. I think you're so right on this. And it's a choice, isn't it? A daily choice. And you say that we're all in a joy crisis. Can you just unpack that for us? Our world is in a joy crisis. So I agree with you. How should we respond in this joy crisis?
Absolutely. There's no question that our world is facing a mental health crisis in culture today. The World Health Organization says that 1 in 4 people in the world will experience or will be affected by mental or neurological disorder at some point in their lives. And so this is the reality that we're living in our world today. But I think that when I talk about a joy crisis, I think that crisis goes a layer deeper that we need to examine and consider if we are going to actually come up with a lasting solution. So, I talked about Romans 5 and how it's joy and suffering that produces endurance and character and hope in our lives. And I think that because we tend to neglect the discipline of choosing joy in the midst of our struggles and our challenges, that the results are a decline of these characteristics in both individual lives and then in the populace as a whole. And I personally see this as a crisis, as a joy crisis, because this lack of joy actually leaves people at a disadvantage when they're just trying to navigate through regular life and the challenges of life. Like, it's no wonder that so many people are struggling with depression and anxiety when these characteristics and qualities are on the decline in our lives. And so I think that our response has to be one of intentional and directed efforts, both to restore joy in our personal lives, and then also consider how can we realistically and also compassionately help others to restore joy, to choose joy in their lives as well. Because personally, I think the stakes are high. Like, we just can't send the next generation into a future that is devoid of character and endurance and hope. Like, that's just not an option. We have a responsibility as Christians to address this crisis in our own lives and for those coming after us.
Well, I think that's a really good word in a time that we need it. This development of character and endurance and changing our perspective on even our expectations in our life. How can we get your book? I know it's going to be released on September 27th. So where can people find this?
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll be on Amazon on September 27th, ebook and paperback. You can also head to my website, talasiguerra.com. There's information on there. You can sign up for the mailing list where we'll make sure that you get informed the minute it releases so that you're ready to go and pick up the book. So,
well, thank you for sharing your personal journey and for teaching and equipping us today. I feel like I've already had a shift of perspective. I want to be a joy giver today. And I thank you, Talasi, for your story, your teaching. So go and find her book today, Joy Like a Mountain. Let's break this joy crisis in our nation and around the world. And as Jesus followers, we have everything we need to do that. Thank you for joining us today, Talasi.
Thank you so much.